The recurring problem with the discussions surrounding the missing children incident is that they tend to flatten distinct categories of continuity into a single question, as though the identity of a location, the identity of a set of animatronics, and the persistence of a corporate policy framework must all rise or fall together. The original games do not support that kind of simplification and, in fact, actively resist it by distributing relevant information across multiple formats that emphasize procedure and space rather than character identity. When the evidence is examined in the order it is presented rather than the order fandom habitually prefers, the conclusion that the Freddy's Fazbear's Pizza seen in FNAF 1 is the same physical location where the missing children incident occurred emerges, not as a speculative leap, but as the most conservative reading of the available material. While the assumption that his continuity requires the physical withered animatronics to be identical to the FNAF 1 classics remains unsupported by explicit text. The only explicit account of the missing children incident within the original continuity is contained in the newspaper clippings displayed in FNAF 1, and these clippings are careful to situate the event within a specific concrete environment. The children are described as having been lured into a back room at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza by a man wearing a mascot costume, and the later article expands the scope of the incident within changing its spatial framing. There is no indication that the crime occurred across multiple locations, nor is there any suggestion that the restaurant in question was an abstract stand-in for a chain-wide phenomenon. The wording consistently points to a single establishment, one that possessed a back room accessible enough to be misused while remaining sufficiently removed from public oversight to facilitate concealment. What matters here is not simply that a back room existed, but that it was treated as a space whose misuse required retroactive explanation and control. The newspapers do not describe this room in technical terms, but they establish its narrative function, which is to serve as the point of separation between public performance space and hidden activity. This distinction becomes critical when played alongside the training tapes introduced in FNAF 3, which are explicitly concerned with regulating access to a particular kind of hidden room, whose characteristics align closely with the function implied by the newspaper descriptions. The FNAF 3 tapes define the safe room with unusual specificity, describing it as an extra room, not included in the digital map layout, hidden from customers, invisible to animatronics, and always off camera. This description does not read as an abstract guideline, but as documentation for a standardized architectural feature designed to exist outside normal systems of observation. The tapes then proceed to warn that under no circumstance should a customer ever be taken into this room, a warning that is immediately contextualized by management's awareness that the Springtrap Bonnie animatronic has been noticeably moved. The proximity of these statements within the same training material suggests a casual relationship in which the movement of a springlock suit within or around a restricted space represents a known risk vector rather than a hypothetical concern. It is important to note that the tapes do not introduce the safe room as a new innovation responding to an unspecified future danger, but as a pre-existing feature whose misuse has become sufficiently serious to warrant explicit procedural reinforcement. This framing aligns naturally with the earlier depiction of a back room used to isolate victims, even though the newspapers themselves lack the technical vocabulary later supplied by the tapes. The connection between these descriptions does not depend on terminological equivalence, but on functional continuity in which a hidden camera space associated with the mascot costumes becomes the focal point of both the crime and the corporate response. The most consequential information contained in the FNAF 3 tapes, however, is not the definition of the safe room itself, but the description of how the company ultimately chooses to deal with these spaces. The Night 6 tape states that safe rooms are being sealed at most locations, including the one relevant to the tape, through the construction of a false wall over the old doorway, and that nothing is being taken out beforehand. This statement establishes a deliberate practice of sealing restricted rooms without inventorying or removing their contents, effectively freezing whatever remains inside at the moment of closure. The significance of this policy cannot be overstated because it provides a mechanical explanation for the persistence of physical remnants across long spans of time without requiring ongoing maintenance or acknowledgement. This sealing practice is considered alongside the FNAF 1 newspaper describing the restaurant's eventual closure after a prolonged period of decline following the tragedy. The implication is that the building itself was not immediately destroyed or replaced, but instead remained in operation long enough for its most problematic spaces to be rendered inaccessible, rather than resolved. The language of the newspaper frames the closure as the culmination of years of struggle, not as an abrupt response to the incident itself, which supports a reading in which architectural continuity is preserved, even as public-facing elements are modified or removed. Framing of FNAF 3 reinforces this interpretation by presenting Fazbear Frights as a salvage operation that recovers both documentary artifacts, such as training tapes, and physical objects described simply as a real one, without distinguishing between their original locations beyond their shared origin in defunct or abandoned facilities. This narrative choice implies that the remnants of earlier locations systematically catalogued or relocated, but left in situ until later rediscovery, a process entirely consistent with the sealing practices described in the tapes. Taken together, these elements form a coherent picture in which the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, seen in FNAF 1, occupies the same physical structure where the missing children incident occurred, retaining its hidden architectural features and the consequence of their misuse, even if its outward operations change. This conclusion does not rely on visual similarity between game maps, nor does it require the identification of specific animatronic models across titles. Instead, it rests on the continuity of space, policy, and corporate behavior, all of which are explicitly documented within the games themselves. Tendency to conflate this location continuity with animatronic body continuity arises largely from the assumption that the identity of the characters must be preserved through the same physical units in order for the narrative to remain coherent. Text does not support this assumption. The FNAF 2 newspaper addressing the location's closure states that the new animatronics will be scrapped, while the original characters are being kept in hopes of a possible reorganization. This wording is deliberately ambiguous, referring to characters rather than machines, and it does not specify whether the physical animatronics associated with those characters are preserved intact, dismantled for parts, or replaced entirely. This ambiguity is compounded by the visual and mechanical differences between the withered animatronics and the classed animatronics, including differences in endoskeleton design that the games never explicitly reconcile. While it's possible to propose a rebuild or retrofit scenario that accounts for these differences, such a proposal remains an inference rather than a confirmed fact, and the games never require it in order to explain the progression of events. Because the location continuity argument is grounded in architecture and policy rather than in character hardware, it does not collapse if the withered animatronics are treated as distinct physical entities from the FNAF 1 classics. In fact, separating these questions allows the argument to remain conservative, avoiding the need to resolve ambiguities the text leaves intentionally open. The building can persist even as its contents change, particularly in a corporate context that consistently prioritizes concealment over transparency. At this point, it is useful to introduce explicitly and carefully a non-factual explanatory layer, not as evidence, but as a means of demonstrating that the canon does not forbid certain configurations. One assumes, purely hypothetically, that MCI era equipment, including damaged animatronics or springlock suits associated with the incident, was sealed within restricted rooms when the building was restructured or closed, then the presence of later animatronics in the same building does not imply a direct physical lineage between those sealed units and the ones seen on stage in FNAF 1. This assumption is not asserted as canon, but as a demonstration of plausibility within the established policy framework. Under such a model, the safe room functions as a repository for unresolved material, sealed and forgotten in accordance with the company policy, while the public-facing animatronics are replaced or reorganized to allow operations to continue. This model aligns with the franchise's repeated depiction of Fazbear Entertainment as an entity that manages crisis through obfuscation and partial measures rather than through comprehensive reform. Even without adopting this hypothetical layer, however, the core argument remains intact. The text supports the conclusion that the FNAF 1 restaurant is the MCI location because it preserves the architectural features and policy responses associated with the incident. It does not require the physical withered animatronics to be identical to the classics in order for that continuity to hold. The horror of the setting derives not from the literal sameness, but from the persistence of unresolved spaces and the refusal to dismantle the structures that enabled harm in the first place. In this reading, the sealed rooms are not narrative conveniences, but physical manifestations of institutional denial, and the building itself becomes the true through line of the story, carrying the weight of its history forward regardless of which animatronics are placed on stage at any given moment.